Hello and welcome to Shropshire Museums Collection Centre. We're here in the biology store, which houses over 80,000 specimens, which include plants and animals from all around the world, but also from Shropshire. These collections have been made over 170 years, and during that period, collecting has had its own impact on the environment. In this film, we'll look at that impact in both the numbers of specimens that were collected, but also how collectors and museums have chosen to display them. So the collections at Ludlow and Shrewsbury were really formed in the early Victorian period, when collecting was suddenly becoming a huge craze. So every gentleman in his library would want to have a collection of some sort, in many cases butterflies and moths, or it could be coins and medals or porcelain. But there was always a collecting craze to suit whatever your tastes were. Now these had kind of grown out of the idea of gentlemen going on the kind of the grand tour and collecting souvenirs and bringing them home, and that's kind of how the idea of collecting started. But by the Victorian period, you've got the start of consumerism, and that people can travel by rail and steam over huge distances. And people had more disposable wealth, so they could afford to spend a bit of money on cabinets and nice shiny things, and people start amassing their own collections to have at home.
And showing them off to their friends, I imagine.
That was a huge part of it.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. It was about showing not only that you had the disposable wealth to have these things, but that you were a man of intellect and knew a little bit of the science or the history behind the objects that you had in your collection.
And really, when you look at how these have been mounted, there's a great deal of skill that's gone into producing this case.
Yes, yeah. So some people would have done it themselves at home and would have learnt how to do it as a sort of a hobby to keep you amused of an evening. Other people would have gone to specialists to prepare them for them. And in fact, you could even buy a ready-made cabinet, so you could pretend you'd done it, but actually had somebody else prepare it and put it all together for you.
Cheating, that would be, wouldn't it? But you were saying there's a darker side to this, because, I mean, are any of these species no longer with us?
These moths, I think they're all still found in Britain today, but if you think of how many libraries had a drawer like this in them, we're talking about hundreds and thousands of moths and other creatures being collected, and it did have an impact on populations.
Those are just the ones that made the cut, because they would have caught several of each and picked the best specimen, wouldn't they?
Exactly.
So the other ones, they weren't used, and yeah.
I mean, one thing that it had a huge impact on was birds. There was a huge craze for collecting birds, not just to have them sort of beautifully displayed like this one, but also the skins were sold to people making hats and other items of clothing for ladies. And there was a huge fashion for having like an entire bird of paradise mounted on your head. And that had a huge effect on bird numbers.
Wow. So there's a couple, well, this one, I've no idea what this is.
This is not a Shropshire bird, this is the Hooyah bird from New Zealand. And you won't have seen one because they are now extinct for this very reason. I mean, its feathers had always been popular in Maori culture as a symbol of your status and authority. You would have worn a Hooyah feather in your headdress. Then in 1901, the Duke and Duchess of York visited New Zealand, and a Maori chief put a Hooyah bird feather in the hat of the Duke of York, and then everybody had to have a Hooyah bird feather in their hat. And right across New Zealand and Britain, people were clamouring for these feathers. And these birds that were already suffering from their environment being deforested became extinct within 6 years.
just because they put a feather in the Duke of York's hat.
It's incredible, isn't it, that that could have had such an impact on one species.
And that's fashion for you. That's the...
Well, if I just bring this across to show you. There we go. This is a lady's Victorian cape, and you can see the number of exotic bird feathers that just went into making this. So we've got hummingbird feathers down here, and I've got a tiny little hummingbird here. So you can imagine how many hummingbirds it went in to just decorating those bits. And then other iridescent feathers off kind of exotic birds like these. So that had a huge effect on bird numbers.
That's absolutely gorgeous as well. I assume really quite delicate.
It is, yeah, reasonably delicate. I mean, this one is in quite good condition, but I mean, if it ever got a pest infestation like clothes moths or carpet beetles in it, it would soon fall apart.
It wouldn't last long. Such fantastic colours. But this isn't just the dead parrot sketch, is it? There are other birds that have become extinct. There
are indeed, and I quite like this drawing that was done for Ludlow Museum of a great auk. It's not the best piece of art, but the reason they had a drawing rather than the real bird was because their numbers were so low by even the 1870s. We know that great auks were hunted both for their meat but also for making pillows. There was nothing quite as nice as resting your head on a great auk pillow.
A great auk pillow.
And then as these birds became rarer and rarer, collectors saw it as an absolute highlight for their collection to have one. So all of a sudden, every bird collector wants to have a great auk.
Quick, get one before they're all gone.
Exactly. And we know Henry Shaw, who was the taxidermist in Shrewsbury, he managed to get his hands on 6 and he mounted them and sold those on. But still, the demand was coming for great auks. So we know Henry, being an astute businessman, decided that he could make great auks by stitching together little auks into a bigger bird, and then sold models of great auks.
All right, sir. I've got a great auk here for you. It's just don't look too closely at it.
Well, it fooled us because we had it on display in Shrewsbury Museum and Art Gallery, and it wasn't until a specialist came and actually did a genetic test on the feathers that we discovered that there were all sorts of things like razorbill in there, but no great auk.
Good gosh, what a scandal.
But it isn't, of course, just birds that people were collecting and their numbers were reducing down. We've also got the plant collecting as well. So this is a herbarium sheet, a prepared specimen of a plant. So this herbarium sheet comes from a collection that was put together by George Moore. George Moore was an industrialist who came to Shropshire to set up a pottery.
Ah, yes, M.A.W. Moore.
Yes.
Right, of course.
And his love of collecting plants influenced a lot of the designs that he used for pottery. So you'll see tiles with ferns on that were influenced by the stuff that he was out there collecting in the countryside.
Wow, so the designs of the tiles were inspired by his love of collecting?
Yes, yes. And fern collecting was huge in the Victorian period. I mean, people would travel in groups on trains out to the Lake District and to Scotland to go and dig up ferns to take home. And this poor little specimen here is of a Killarney fern. This one was actually even collected in Killarney in Ireland by George Moore. And these were found both in Ireland, the Lake District and Scotland, until they were almost wiped out completely by people just digging them up to take them home and press them.
But of course you can't do that sort of thing these days, can you? That's all now.
Yes, I mean, it was a result of this kind of sudden decrease in plants and animals that legislation started being put together. and people came together to form things like the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. I mean, a lot of those societies were actually founded by ladies who were outraged by their friends wearing dead birds on their hats in such huge numbers that they decided that they needed to do something to protect these birds. So a lot of these people saw the impact that their collecting was having on the world around them and decided something would have to be done.
Gosh, and that was 150 years ago.
Yes.
Yes. And, well, you know where we are now.
Yes. So the way that museums collected and displayed objects not only affected how people thought about the natural world, but about other cultures and societies, as this object will give us a nice example.
Great intro for something I'm just holding off here as a reveal. There we are. We'll pop that down there.
So this is a Salway mask from Sierra Leone. Now this is part of our ethnographic collection that was collected by people in the late 19th and early 20th century, really to tell people about the wider British Empire and about cultures abroad. But I mean, there was a lot of prejudice in the way these objects were displayed, and most ethnographic collections were displayed alongside natural sciences collections as a kind of a looking at simpler cultures and societies, rather than seeing them as perhaps an object that we might think of today as either a social history object or a piece of decorative art that tells us about the art of a culture.
So, okay, what was it for? It looks like it fits over the head.
Yes, it's a helmet mask. Now, as high status girls in Sierra Leone, as they came of age, there was a ceremony that would take place, and each girl would have a mask that was made specifically for her. So each one is individual to that one person. And it's about expressing her femininity and about her power as a woman. And this would be worn at her initiation, and then she would wear it for certain ceremonies within her culture as well. So there's a huge story around it, rather than it just being displayed as an object of curiosity that's been kind of taken, often forcibly, from another culture.
So things have obviously changed. And how things like this would have been displayed when they were collected 150 years ago has very much changed now with modern thinking about how the world works and the respect that we show to other communities and people.
Yes, I mean, the interpretation that we would use for an object like this is very different today. We would want to actually involve people from that community to tell us about the stories and the meanings behind that object for them, not just to show it as an object of curiosity from a culture that's so different from ours that we don't understand it, which was kind of the approach that the Victorians took.
So that covers cultural pieces. How does that then relate to the natural world?
Well, with the natural world, it's more about how we collect and why. So these days, Shropshire Museums focuses on Shropshire natural sciences. So we don't worry about things from elsewhere in the world. We've focused down onto recording and interpreting the natural sciences of the county. And what we do now is, instead of going out and collecting specimens, we've focused down on collecting data and information. So we'll look at the ranges of birds and bird sightings, but we wouldn't necessarily want to shoot it and put it in the museum now. The natural sciences collections are a great resource for allowing children to get up close and personal, but there are only so many badges a museum can hold.
And I guess this sort of evolution of us understanding the natural world has ultimately, 150 years later, led us to understand it better, but also cherish it more.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's also about teaching people the importance of actually caring about this resource and making sure that we're not making impacts on the natural world that we were making before as museums, but also as a society, about how we can actually use these collections to inspire people towards, say, citizen science and getting involved in counting birds in their back garden or looking at butterfly numbers. So we're becoming far more involved in that side of things rather than just collecting, like a stamp collection, one of everything.